Welcome to Communion and Shalom.
In this podcast, we are exploring how the biblical and historic Christian faith can engage sexuality, ethnicity, culture, and our local communities as we pursue the flourishing of God's kingdom. Our goal is to engage these topics charitably and with nuance.
Hello. Welcome to yet another episode of Communion and Shalom. This is David Frank.
And I'm TJ.
So it's just us here today, which we love. We really love interviewing different folks, getting their perspectives. But we're here today to share some of our in-process thinking. We have some upcoming interviews with folks who've had different types of trans experiences, and those will probably not come out all like right in a row. But as they come out, we wanted to, rather than, sometimes we've done like review episodes after interviewing guests, like we did with some of our Side A guests. But this time we wanted to do also a preliminary kind of just, where are TJ and I thinking about things? What are we seeing? What are we learning? What are we considering?
Yeah, I think this is a snapshot sort of our current thoughts. But I think we're both willing to keep learning, develop better sensibilities, change our minds if necessary as we engage the conversation more with particular people. But you and I have been talking about this topic for a while, though, just personally together. And I know we both have talked with trans people, U.S.-based trans people, right? Just from friendly acquaintances or neighbors or colleagues or something. And so I think that's part of our thoughts emerge from those experiences with our people. Some of the people we talked with are Christian, some are not Christian. So we've engaged both those type of groups.
And we definitely, for a while we thought, we shouldn't even talk about it on this podcast until we interview people. But I think, as you said, from our listening to other interviews, having direct conversations with different friends, reading different literature, that we thought, okay, we can say something. But yes, you can take it as a snapshot with all the charity in your heart. If, please don't cancel or crucify us. That's and we wanted to start with just kind of lay of the land, and that's actually one big piece I think of the lay of the land is that whether it's certain parts of Christian culture, whether it's certain parts of general American or Western culture, there is this big just fear piece of like, oh, if I say the wrong thing, or if whether it's too progressive or too conservative, not too affirming, not affirming enough, that somebody's gonna hate me and think I'm really evil. And so,
it's true.
And that happens on the sexuality piece too. I still see pastors who they're just like, especially on the pulpit, you should be kind of very careful. But yeah, folks are just afraid to say the wrong thing, use the wrong words, and I do think we need I'm hopeful that we can not be legalistic in any direction on these things, but give space for grace. I don't know.
Charity and nuance. That's what we're about here. So yes.
Yeah.
I also wanted to mention that I think we also want to note that for some people this conversation is very hard, especially people who would fall under the umbrella of trans, and oftentimes that's because of being mistreated in the past or in their present, or occasionally even violence directed towards them.
Yeah.
And that should be part of the process of reflection on this topic. So I don't think that's the only thing to talk about the topic. Go ahead.
I was just going to share, I think for some of our audience, this might be a really sympathetic story. We have a friendly acquaintance who is a biological female who just looks more masculine, dresses kind of neutral-ish, and even though because of their gender dysphoria, would like to use the male bathroom will go and use the female bathroom when there's not a gender-neutral bathroom available, and has been physically accosted coming out of the woman's bathroom because somebody thought that they were a man and who was being a creep or a perv entering into the woman's bathroom. And it's just, for someone who's, even that kind of indirect, that's not even targeting them because they were trying to transition or anything like that, but just how difficult these things can be for those who are experiencing gender dysphoria and living it out in different ways.
Yeah. And also, this is lay of the land-ish, so I'll say one more thing. I was also going to mention that these things do intersect with queerness. So we talk about queerness, like queerness or gayness, but how they intersect is complex and could be multiple other episodes. So I don't know if we'll gauge that directly, but I have mentioned in the past, I think, on public episodes, like, for example, that I had gender dysphoria as a youth. And for me, I'm you would call me cisgender now. So I had some sort of resolution of that, but I am still queer. And if you look at the historical examples, a lot of people who were transitioning gayness, you might say, they work together. A lot of people we call gay now in other societies, they would have been trans maybe. So there's some connection, but we're not going to engage in that deeply because it's complex. We're just going to gesture to it as a thing. So, yeah.
TJ, do you have, we're already using trans and transgender interchangeably. Is there just what definition are we using when we say transgender? And I think for short, trans, we mean the same thing.
Yeah. I think we should use this definition as our preliminary definition, open to revision. It's provisional. Denoting or relating to a person whose sense of personal identity and gender does not correspond with their birth sex. Okay. So, yeah.
So it's their sense of self is...
Or their gender, which is...
Their sense of self, their sense
more
of
social.
Their own gender has some type of friction with their biological...
like our friends at Eden Invitation say gender disconnect. That's one term that they sometimes use.
Yeah.
And
that's in the same way that homosexual now feels like a little more clinical, and so it's less common. I think gender dysphoria is a little bit where it's like, that's like the clinical psychological assessment.
Yes.
But the on the ground experience, we're like, there's disconnect, there's discord. But
this definition also relies on this distinction between sex and gender, right? It's that way of framing, and also identity, or I guess personal feeling as well. But it's that way of framing these two things as they can differ. In fact, I think we'll get into this more, but I've found that framing between sex and gender to be helpful, and I won't talk about this so much, but I'll mention some of this later. But it does seem to correspond with reality, where there's some people who they have a birth sex, and the way they live is different from how their birth sex in their communities generally live. Because for most people, their birth sex and how they live in their communities corresponds. Like, men usually live in a certain way in their community, women live a certain way in their community. And there's obviously overlap, but they're not the same. And then for these people we call trans or other sort of categories that are related but different, it means that, again, they're living in a different way than their birth sex generally lives in their community. So all to say is, I think that is a helpful way to think about it. I'm actually aware of some Christians who really reject that for some reason, but I generally think they haven't done the work to understand the comparative nature of what we call transgender, how it does exist among humans and even Christian humans. Like, it's a thing.
And I think outside of the trans conversation or experience, gender is actually a really helpful, anytime you're doing cross-cultural interactions, comparisons, to be able to distinguish between gender and sex is really valuable, because in both, a ancient medieval Norwegian experience and a modern Mexican, Latin American experience, they are both, operating in that world of sex, meaning of a male-female distinction. That's the same. But the way that they live out those roles, those maybe stereotypes, assumptions, expectations, just the imagination that's connected with men and women. And there's some societies that have had a more designated
space for like third gender.
Basically. But it's just even outside of, before you get to anything outside of the typical, to be able to describe the way that they conceive of the life of a man, the life of a woman, all that social construction in just the real honest way. We have ideas, we have patterns that we live out in communities. That's helpful to talk about as the gendered world. Good example.
So, good example.
For those who are more critical of their separation as ideas, you just need to recognize that maybe you think of like, different people have different stereotypes for men and women. That itself, as it's borne out in different cultures, is more or less gender. Like, at least one part of it. And so if you're already thinking about gender stereotypes, you are engaging in
concept of gender,
a certain kind of gender framework, certain
discourse.
Ideas of what it means to live out that, which is just way more than just like these very discrete phenomenon of what genitals you have. And there's just like, yes, there's obviously some physical like repercussions of that, but gender goes way beyond those intimacies and it completely shapes our world, which I think gets into the fact, and this kind of lay of the land, what are some of the things we're considering? The Bible is, of course, in a gendered world, and we can say is also affirming that right at the beginning, that the image of God, and this is actually pretty countercultural, you could say, to a lot of ancient mythologies, that male and female are integral parts of the image of God right at the beginning in Genesis. There have been many philosophies throughout time that have seen women as defective men. And so this positive account of the sexes.
Sometimes Christianity ran into that too. And that was a wrong movement for the Christian church in our opinions.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
And I would say that they've probably inherited that largely from certain Greek thinkers and maybe other sources. But the biblical narrative itself, I would say, is this, positive vision for the sexes, which I don't imagine. How can you have a positive vision of the sexes that doesn't create a gendered world? And then you have like complicated, but like, well, what does that mean? Like we're very egalitarian and individualistic, and so we're very like, but stereotypes are bad because that stifles our individualism, but we can't ever escape them. And so are we just in this constant battle against stereotypes? And then we see a verse like Deuteronomy 22:5, where it talks more or less about cross-dressing. A woman putting on man's garments, a man putting on woman's garments. So it's like, well, clearly those garments are part of their gendered construction. There's nothing in,
like a cloak.
The clothes are not sexed. The clothes don't have DNA. The clothes themselves are only male and female clothes because we believe them to be, because we have created those associations. And so why is the Bible commenting on that? Why do our constructions about gendered belonging, gendered whatever, why do those matter? Was it a lead up to certain types of sexual like protections? Is it something else? I'm not at any conclusions, but we're just looking at some of these pieces of, we see genders in the Bible.
Yeah. I know you've taken a class on gender in the scriptures.
Oh yeah. Was it called the Biblical Theology of Gender?
Maybe.
I think so.
Remember.
It was a fascinating class. I mean, if I won't be able to even say a tenth of all that was covered, but it was looking at how in the Genesis narrative, especially when you start seeing it in parallel with other writings of its time, that even the outside, prior to Adam and Eve, that the creation narrative is already kind of working in a gendered space where the sun and the moon have this gendered vibe of the sun having a masculinity and the moon representing femininity, and the land and the sea, when they're separated, is this separation of the masculine land and the feminine seas, and so it's just, again, you need to have this concept of masculinity and femininity, which is bigger than genetic sex, in order to really interact with certain imagery, symbolism.
That's the idea.
That
reminds me of C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy. I think I mentioned to you, especially for book 2, maybe actually the whole book, the whole series, gender is one of the key themes. And I don't know if people realize that when they read it necessarily. But if you think about what Mars is like in the first book versus what Venus is like, C.S. Lewis is, for example, showing some sort of idea of what masculinity is like and femininity. And then in the third book, they come together. And that's the whole question. What does it mean to come together? And then you see the angels, who are I guess deities of some level, who are exemplifying the masculinity and femininity without being embodied. They're not humans. So they're not embodied in this sort of story. But yeah, that reminds me of what you're talking about. So
I really want to reread that Space Trilogy, because
I'd recommend anyone reread it with a gendered, like focusing on gender, just to see what you pick up, because it's worth doing.
Yeah, and the third book really hits on gender a lot too. Actually, maybe a little bit more obviously, but I'll have to go back to the first two. I think one of the difficulties that we have with gender on the ground is because I mentioned already our individualism, that whenever we say, what C.S. Lewis described this planet in this way because he has a certain sense of masculinity. Well, not every man embodies the epitome of whatever that adjective or virtue may be. And I think that's just a very modern problem that we have, where we think that all of us need to, or that gender is, that whatever it means to be human it needs to be fully expressed in me and each and every one of us.
Yes.
Versus if you say humans are creative, and then you look at the example of the Eiffel Tower and the Mona Lisa, and we can say this thing generally about humans, and we can look at, the individual ways that each of us are creative, but we also recognize that no one of us will fully, ultimately it's a part of imaging God, of reflecting his nature in us, that's done in community, and that even the Eiffel Tower is not the work of one person. That is many thinkers put together, that our creativity is something that we're bearing out as a community of persons. And I'm trying to stretch my mind into thinking about what we might normally throw under the rug as like bad gender stereotypes, to saying, yes, we can do certain types of statistical analyses to say what percentage of men kind of reflect this a little bit, what percentage of women reflect this. But more than that, if we're thinking more abstractly or artistically, what are ways that there's that whatever a certain masculine characteristic, what's one to use?
Strength is one.
Sure, yeah, strength. Men are on average have more muscle mass.
Stronger, than women. Especially upper body muscle mass.
Particularly upper body muscle mass. And so there's this association of strength. And then a man like me who doesn't have that much upper body strength, maybe, I don't know where I compared to women on average, but
I don't know.
By no means do I think of myself as someone with a lot of upper body strength. Like, I don't need to look down on myself, or I don't need to either look down on myself for not fitting into that characterization, nor do I need to doubt that association, but just can, in almost like, hold with open hands, I am part of men, this gender, and we have this strength. uh, and just let it be. This is something that it's almost more of my conclusion of trying to say, I think gender is real, but how do I hold that as an individual when we start building up these gendered associations? So that's kind of where you might, because I think it is important that it's like, how are we ever going to talk about the complication, like the difficult experiences and varied experiences and realities related to trans and transness, if we don't even know how to deal with gender for those who don't have gender discord?
Yeah.
And
good question.
And so that's why I took that biblical theology of gender, and I've been trying to just kind of take a few steps back and just like, what is gender? What does it mean to do gender well as a society? And
just as a question, in your class, was that directly talked about?
No.
Or is that kind of skated over?
I think it was just looking at more biblical imagery and allusions and themes. And
okay.
I mean, people have brought up questions, but I can't remember where all the different conversation went. But the readings were mainly just focused on the Bible and literary features.
We should briefly touch on intersex as a situation or a condition or an experience. Just to say that we recognize this exists. It's important to talk about, but it's not precisely a trans experience, even though perhaps related sometimes. And we recognize this intersex can have notable medical impacts on a person's life. And from what I know, in most human populations, it's a relatively rare situation, condition, experience. But it's hard. That's also hard to know, because intersex could mean that there's something different about their internal body, and we don't always check for whatever reason, or not all people have had access to ways of checking necessarily what their inner body was like. So yeah. But anyways, I'll just say I think we're just going to gesture towards that as part of the conversation, but not actually what we're going to talk about in the rest of this episode. So,
and sometimes people use intersex to, I think, as I don't know if it's a straw man or as kind of a tool to say, well, look, there's people who don't fit your male-female genetic simple situation. So, of course, gender is either a spectrum or gender is unrooted from the biological reality. And I think we're just recognizing that intersex is a pretty unique experience that might have some overlap for certain people with trans experience, gender discord, but it also just has a lot of things that aren't related. And I think that they can be sufficiently largely actually maybe dealt with separately as we think about gender.
Sure. I hope one day, I'd love to interview an intersex person one day if they'd be willing to come on and talk with us, especially if they're Christian, just to see how they process their experience and situation.
Yeah.
So,
I said largely dealt with separately. I don't know if I stand behind that to think about that more, but
it's okay.
So, I think, did we already talk about violence against trans people? I think you mentioned that.
Well, I mean, maybe I just want to make sure, I think clearly as Christians, we think violence against people is wrong. And that obviously includes trans people. And I think some trans people think that needs to be said. So let's say it now.
Yeah. I mean, there's just just no, it just has absolutely, it does not matter however someone identifies, however you identify them or group them or think about them or judge them, that they somehow become more worthy of your hatred or anybody's like hatred or violent actions to them. But every single person, no matter their criminal background, no matter how much you like their political opinions or etc., they have dignity as
Yeah.
people and should not be targeted because they make us uncomfortable.
Yeah, not at all. So there's more. I think there's more to say on that, but let's just leave it there for now.
Yeah, I'm just, I, yeah, I'm just like, I wonder how much. I think like it's happened. I think trans people have experienced this. I wonder how much just Democrats and Republicans subject each other to the same type of.
It's a good question.
Just
The
vitriol.
American
against
political
one another.
parties can get pretty heated,
Yeah.
like political debates. So yeah, that seems right.
I think.
Do you have any other lays of the land, or can I ask my question?
Did we mention pronouns?
No.
So
we should mention it.
I think we might get into pronouns later. We'll see what we have time for. That's obviously a big part of the thing, and in Canada especially, there's I think been more legislation around considering not using someone's pronouns as hate speech or potentially criminalizing it. I'm not sure to what degree the offenses are. So just recognizing there's both the very just like personal, interracial, neighborly dynamics of pronouns, but then there's also ways that people have tried to make these cultural changes via policy.
And coercive force, policy and coercive force. Yeah. Yeah. I had a question for you. Let me think if I can remember it. I don't think I remember it, sadly. Sorry.
I think we would want to just speak about maybe we already said it sufficiently. Sex is not a social construct, but gender is, at least in part.
Yeah, that's great. We mentioned that was intrinsic in the definition we use for trans, right? That was how that definition was framing things preliminarily or implicitly. But this is also how I view it, and I think you as well. And I think people who get afraid of social construction as a concept, I think you know a few people, they usually get afraid because they think by using that framework, social construction, which I think is true, a true way of viewing what reality is like. Sex, just because some things are socially constructed doesn't mean everything's socially constructed, right? So I would say sex is not socially constructed, but gender is, and gender makes assumptions about like male bodies and female bodies that are different in different places. You mentioned like long ago Norway and long ago Mexico, but we could even say like urban U.S. versus rural U.S. They sometimes make different assumptions about masculinity or manness, right? And so it can be in the same time period, the same cultural context. But this is basically how I think about it. I think you, and it's, again, as I said, it seems to be the most feasible framework to engage with because it actually works. It can make sense of the world as it is. And then I think it also shows we don't have to be afraid of the concept of social construction. And we shouldn't, because human beings are socially constructed. They're always socially constructing, and so much of human reality is socially constructed. It's based on the human social and historical context. Even the language that we use, right? We're speaking English right now for historical and social reasons. And that's a social construct. It's from a particular history, and we're using it for particular reasons because of our history and our social situation. So I'll just say, social constructs are real. We don't think sex is a social construct. This is obviously a debated point. People argue over this in intellectual circles, but I would say it's not. But gender is, at least in part. And I say in part because gender can, like you said, if you look at distribution patterns around human traits, they do tie to sex and thus to gender, right? Like, for example, a human universal seems to be that men participate in more coalitional violence, meaning men more often form groups and do violent actions than women. That's both sex-related and it's gender. It's both at the same time. Or women participate in more child care in general. Again, both sex and gender, because it affects both. So, yeah. So both of them can be engaged in, both gender and sex are sex is not a social construct. Gender, at least somewhat is, but not in total, because it's anchored in sex typically somehow. Right. Yeah.
Would it be fair? Maybe I'm just going to abstract on trying to help our friends who are like, "Ooh, social construction means it's not real."
Oh yeah.
I think of when I say "yeah,"
Mm-hmm.
you could say from a it's like very like I made this certain sounds that you could record on a microphone that could be displayed in a sound wave, however you think of it. Spell it out phonetically, YA. But what that means is completely socially constructed. In Germany, it's a standard way of saying yes. In English, still generally would be a form of saying yes, affirmation. It communicates something socially. But in Spanish, it means already or something similar to that.
Yeah.
And
it could even depend on the situation. Like maybe you mean that sarcastically. Maybe you mean that just directly, like, yeah. Or maybe you're like, yeah. Like, kind of thinking like, oh, I don't know, it's kind of, you're being stupid, maybe like, yeah. It's socially situated. The speech you made, as you said, a sound was made, but how that's interpreted is the next level question. It's not obvious. So, and if you go to some place without speaking English, they don't use that word. It's like meaningless in that situation, right? If you go and say "yeah" in some context, it may not have any meaning. It's just like this man made some noise. Mm-hmm. Okay.
But like the fact that it's all socially constructed doesn't mean it's not like, oh, the meaning that you were intending and did communicate is very real and important. And we have a sense of what's happening, what's going on. And that's part of our lived social reality. Mm-hmm. It's just, it's recognizing.
And I want to say
how
social constructions
is human relational reality, and which is real and important. It's like what God, I think, loves. Like He created us. He's created us for all this meaning making and interplay, and into the
so much. Mm-hmm.
So social construction should not be demurred or looked down upon. It just needs to be understood.
And again, social constructions are real. They're just not universal necessarily. Like, for example, democracy is a social construction. It's just not universal. Like, not all human beings do this. And democracy has particular histories of why it emerged and based on what assumptions.
Yeah, and democracy will play itself out differently in different culture contexts.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, we have a whole another episode, I think, on social construction, so we should move on.
Yes. I'm going to talk about, should I move on to third genders? Just because this influences how I think about this.
You are a social scientist. So I think I was a little hesitant when I first heard you bring these things, but you have a few different examples. Walk us through a little bit.
Yeah. So this influences in part how I think about this. And I'm going to provide examples of 3 third genders in different cultural contexts and time periods. These do not precisely align with what Western speakers or English speakers mean when they say gay or transgender, but there's overlap. There's also differences. And this also kind of brings out the example of, again, sex and genders being different things. So this first one is contemporary. These people still exist. This is in Oaxaca, which is in Mexico. And it's among these people called Zapotec. And these are people who are called mushes or mushis. I've heard both. And basically they're one of the most recorded sort of examples of non-Western indigenous sort of, you might say trans, again, not precisely the same, but a little bit related types of people. These are usually biological men who live as women or live as both men and women in some way. Some marry women and have children, while others have sexual relationships with men primarily or exclusively. And they both do male work and female work sometimes. So these ones kind of they straddle both. And they're considered a third gender in sort of, at least in the English way of categorizing them that has been used. Another one is Fa'afafine, which is from America or American Samoa in the Polynesian Islands. These are biological men who integrate both male and female traits. There's also a term for females who do the same thing. They're called Fa'afafine. And Fa'afafine, again, do they do both male and female, but they usually do more female tasks and work and orientation. And they usually have male sexual partners. And sometimes people raise young boys as fafafine if they think that maybe there's more need for people to help in the household. Like if there's not enough girls in the family to help in the household, they might try to raise one of their sons as fafafine. A third one, which I think is the most interesting to some of our conversations, in the 1950s, there was an anthropologist named Simon Messing, and he was in Ethiopia among the Amhara people. And he found people called, I don't know if this is the correct pronunciation, but Wander Warad, literally means male, female. And they were men who are generally living, biological men generally living like females. And Messing said they were viewed as God's mistake, quote unquote. And they were considered physically defective, but they were still tolerated. And this is most interesting to me because these people were Christians. And the author didn't give any indication that these people were rejected from their communities, even though they often left their household, because sometimes their kin were ashamed. But otherwise, they could go and live in society. Women usually considered them as like their brother, and men didn't have a problem with them because they were just, they were just a certain type. They were like a certain type of person who would engage out with women, but weren't challenging the men in any respect. And so they were basically accommodated, even though people saw something different and or in their opinion was disorder in these people's lives. They were part of the process. Now, I'm just touching on these. There's a lot more you can talk about each one. I'm sure whole books have been written about at least one of them, Mushi or Mushes. I would encourage anyone who's interested in these topics to research them more, check them out. I'd love to talk about them more someday. But I just want to mention them because for me, this has shown me in my own work or my thoughts that there are other human societies where these types of people emerge, like people who are usually living as the other sex, right? And so I tend to think of this as something that just happens among human beings sometimes. And then the question comes, if you recognize this happens among at least some human groups, maybe not everyone, but some, then the question comes, what sort of life is possible for these people? How is this evaluated? That's a different question. And that makes me want to be more humble in thinking about these things because some of the Christian groups I engage with, they're really skeptical of trans topics or transgender people. And sometimes they advocate sort of angry solutions or angry ideas or something. But I'm hoping that more humility is possible. Additionally, I just want to say these are direct examples trying to show, I also hear some Christians in the US say, like, no, third gender, no, there's no other genders. There's at least people, and we use the topic third gender because they're men who live as women or women who live as men, which is a different experience than most people have, right? Most people connect being male or be female with certain ways of living, and they connect them directly with their biological sex, and they live in that way. There's some people that don't. And we have to, in our ways we think about ethics and living a good life in the world, it's worth thinking about this and describing it. And then also talking about, even if you think this is disordered, how do you accommodate people if this is just part of their lives or reality? So, yeah.
I'm trying to think about, so the fact that it is called a third gender, though, is different than just a specific individual being less gender conforming. Because I have a cousin who, cousins who, man and woman, married, have kids, heterosexuals, fairly normal in those broad brushstrokes. But the way that they balance parenting duties, maybe certain other emotional traits, they kind of think of themselves as gender non-conforming, right? The guy might be more emotional and does a little bit more of the child care, and the wife, is on the flip of what you typically associate. And what you're talking about, I feel like is a step out of this kind of low level gender, like not conforming to the stereotypes in the ways that I'd say like all of us are gender non-conforming to different degrees. Like
Sure.
that's what it means to be an individual, is that you don't, we're different. So I don't think that those small differences are even necessarily, I mean, it depends on how, if you're in a community that really antagonizes you for those small differences,
Yeah.
then
I know.
might feel more predominant of like, hey, just let me
Yeah.
like, and I mean, when does that start becoming a third gender of saying, hey, all you men are like this, and
Yeah.
I'm a little different.
I think it forms a third gender when you start developing a new category for that way of being, and there starts to be a tradition around that. Because like these people, there's something, I guess I would say biological maybe, that there's something that somehow emerges among some people, right? That some people have this some sort of experience, and then people over time make a category for them, and then there's a certain way of living a life or tradition that people understand, and that's when it starts becoming a third gender that's separate. I think your cousin and relative, the married person of your cousin, I would not call them a third gender. They just think they're gender non-conforming somehow. But these people are more gender non-conforming than both of them because all of these people have lived lives. All people who fall in these three categories that I shared of third genders, they live their lives in much more gender segregated ways of being or ways of communities. So, for example, I forgot. Let me figure this out. Mushis, like for example, if male making jewelry is considered masculine, they might not do it, or they might, but it might be more common for them not to do it. But they dress in ways that are opposite sex, and they typically do opposite sex tasks. I think I understand your cousin and your cousin's married spouse. I assume they don't dress in the way of the opposite sex that much.
Well, I think this is where we get into, I think that's important for you to point out that each of these examples that you point out to are occurring in what we might call more indigenous cultures and are in pre-industrial cultures.
Yeah. Even though some of them are still existing now.
Yep.
But
they might have continued, but
yes.
they're, especially, I think maybe when they're first recorded, that, they're communities that still have, and I mentioned pre-industrial because of the way that industrialism and the advent of going into a cash system that we think of capitalism, thinking of capitalism as being in a highly cash-based economy and relationships, has done something to where our world is just much less gendered than it used to be. And a lot of people, I think, generally say that that's great, and would think that it leads to equality. I think there's some interesting conversation as to if it actually does. I think, and I won't get down that rabbit trail, but so it's not just like, a couple traits or associations that like, men are kind of like this personality wise. And in fact, those personality traits are much less emphasized because there's just such strong ways of being, of like, you make jewelry because of what
you're
gender you are, because you're a man. And so if a group of women who start living in different ways and start taking on this jewelry business, and they just start living a way of life that their shape of life doesn't fit into our pre-existing boxes that we have formed as communities.
For them. Yeah, make a new box for them.
And so they created a new box.
Yep. And even if it's rare, it's notable enough that they have a different way of thinking for them. So yeah, there's another example from the Slavic, I forgot which one it was, Russia maybe. But anyways, there's an example where, I forgot what they're called exactly in that context, but basically only men can inherit land, but some families, to keep land within their family, and they sometimes have a daughter inherit land if there's no sons. But then the daughter is asked to live as a man, like literally dress, change the way they talk, like start participating in male events, like going to the tavern with men or whatever, in order to inherit the land. And there also has to be celibate as part of that. That's another way, that's another like another way of like being a third gender kind of. And again, Christian peoples. And that's how they solve a certain problem they think they have of only women shouldn't be allowed to own property. I talked to a pastor friend once, and his first thing was like, "That's misogynistic." I was like, "Yeah, maybe," but at least we can at least say that was their selection of how they solved this issue that they thought they had. So,
And
yeah,
I think we just have to recognize, yeah, genderly is just always so culturally bound, and I think it makes the current context of
there are human universals, though. I want to say that too. Like it is culturally bound. There are human universals. I mentioned a couple earlier. There's a few more, but they're more general.
I just mean that if a new category, a new box is being thought of, it's always in response to just the boxes you have.
Yeah.
And so like you bring up these three examples, and they're each pretty different because out of their different contexts, but there's something where you're like, oh, what you might call some repeating queer experience that it being that it's rising out of in these different soils.
And it's enough of an experience of a psychological phenomena that causes these people to want to live in the opposite, like as an opposite sex person in their communities, right?
And
you
and
and
in
I,
these communities,
you and I have.
Sorry to interrupt. They didn't just move them from one category to the other, but they created a third category. Do I have that right?
Yes, correct. Like you and I was gonna say, you and I have a queer experience, but it hasn't manifested in this particular way, right? You and I don't live as the opposite sex. I don't think that's even it's part of my background, but it wasn't part of your background, to my understanding. Correct. And it's not part of I don't think it's part of my future, and I don't think it's part of your future. We're not planning anytime soon to be living as a woman. So, women. So there's something there. So, okay, I remember my question I wanted to ask you. Maybe I'll ask it to you now, or just mention into it. There's a side B person who I was engaging with, and this person said that they thought that too often Christians focus on the body in trans conversations as the key guide, but not enough the mind. And this person was hypothesizing that the mind, or at least suggesting, perhaps the mind should be the thing that we focus on first. And I don't think that's that point. I don't agree with it actually, but I don't think it's been talked about enough. Like, why do we think the body is the first guide for how we talk about sex and gender? I admit this person probably would agree with certain ideas maybe different ideas than we would about how gender and sex relate, what that means. But it's at least we're thinking about that sort of line of thought.
I just finished the book Transcendent Kingdom, a novel, and it gets into a lot of just psychology and at one point and just science, and it quotes somebody who is just pointing out that the brain is part of the mechanisms that gives us thoughts and feelings, but it is not the source of them. But those are like like our feelings, our thought processes are full embodied realities. So when someone says the mind, I'm even like, you kind of think, oh, brain. Well, no, it's not the brain. It's what is the mind? What is this sense of thought and perception that is, is very brain related, but also, some people have like the brain sex hypothesis, but even that's trying to just root sex in a different part of our body. But mind is actually interesting. It's like, oh, it's our whole sense of.
Yeah, it goes deep.
Yeah.
Like what is consciousness? What is mind?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there a soul? What does soul mean? How does this idea of a soul relate to a body or not? Or is maybe we're all non-reductive physicalism, which is somehow we're just embodied creatures and we're just physical, and then focus on the resurrection of the body in the future.
And what
Yeah,
will
there's a
the
lot there.
resurrection of the body and mind, I suppose.
Yeah, I know.
Of course.
What does that mean?
And mean in the future, especially if
Yeah.
we don't experience sexual intercourse is not part of the expectation with marriage, and because marriage is ceasing post-resurrection. So I don't have an answer right now to your question, but I want to take just the last 2 minutes. What is, with some of maybe, whether it's questions to our upcoming guests or just what is a question that you are still asking in this conversation?
I want to ask them, I'm really curious if trans people particularly, if they consider their experience like potentially part of God's plan, or if it's only like a disordered condition that they just are accommodating. That's one question. And I'm also curious for to what extent do they think transit should be accommodated in society or among the church or society? Those are kind of the two key questions that I have now for potential people we could talk with. So, yeah.
I think the question I have for us Christians is how do we both cast a positive vision for sex and gender as creational goods while cultivating a humility and just maybe grace for the in-progressness, even if we have a sense of certain goals or ideals, of the fact that we are all not yets, and what are ways that whether it's accommodation or just understanding for just real difficulties. And I've been thinking, I think about this a little bit after talking with a pastor with a background in mental health, and of certain mental health conditions that just don't really go away and can be just deeply difficult for the rest of someone's life. And you gain what is our Christian vision for certain things that it will just be hard, and are we ready for that as communities? So that's my question is, what does that mean in this conversation?
Maybe I have one more question. I was thinking, how can the church make this conversation work better, like go better in the context we're in? Because it's so divisive, angry, and violent, even like violent sometimes, maybe more rarely, but sometimes in like the US and other contexts too. But where can the church step in to actually make this conversation go well, other than its current state of affairs, where it's pretty bad? And I admit the different camps are pretty extreme. Like certain types of trans activists are really extreme in what they believe, and certain types of, usually Christians often, are pretty extreme in what they believe. So how do we talk about it? And in some sense, I think Side B community could help like push the conversation forward. So I hope we can do that as part of that question. What can the church do in this conversation?
Well, thank you, TJ. We did not get back to pronouns at all, so I think what we'll do, if you have a few minutes left here before you have to go, we're going to stop this recording for this episode. Thank you all so much for joining, but we will maybe talk a little bit more as a Patreon bonus episode, talking about pronoun hospitality, paternalism. Julie Alot, I think is how she says her name, a Canadian trans woman, and we'll share a little bit about our snapshot of what we're thinking about, what we see with pronouns. So for those who are our patrons, we're grateful. This episode is happening because y'all are supporting us, and it's really fun, and we appreciate both the financial support as well as just the engagement and the extra feedback we get from our patrons. So If you want to join that community, we try to make it really accessible at, I think the lowest tier is just $3 a month. And because we just want people to be able to connect more pretty easily. So that's all for now. Bye, y'all.
Bye.